600,000 men crossed into Russia that summer. Somewhere in a tent behind them, one clerk was writing down every single name. Someone had counted the boots. Someone had counted the horses. Nobody, it turned out, had counted the winter. This is the story of the most expensive arithmetic problem in history. Of those 600,000, barely half were even French. The rest were Poles and Germans and Italians. Half of Europe marched east under one eagle. And it did not begin in the snow. It began on the 24th of June in the full heat of summer. The famous winter was still 5 months away. On paper, this was the best-run business in Europe. Every asset logged, every cost projected. There was only one line nobody could quite control. The Russians refused to give him his battle. They burned their own crops, emptied their own villages, and vanished east. He marched deeper into a country that kept disappearing in front of him. By Smolensk, tens of thousands of his men were already dead. Not from battle, from heat, from thirst, from fever, from the road. The column was shrinking, and the enemy had barely lifted a musket. And here is the part that should unsettle you. The Russians had no brilliant scheme to defeat him. The empty road was the scheme. One old general understood it perfectly. Never give Napoleon the fight he wants. Then, at last, outside a village called Borodino, the Russians turned and stood. On the 7th of September, 250,000 men faced each other on one field. The whole war seemed to hang on that single morning. It became the bloodiest day the world had yet seen. 72,000 men fell in a single day. The French were left holding the field. It bought them nothing but an open road to an empty city. The largest battle of the war was still not the largest line in the ledger. On September 14th, the Grande Armée marched into Moscow at last. Every man expected the same thing, a delegation with the keys. No delegation came because there was almost no one left to send one. Governor Rostopchin had ordered the city emptied and prepared. That evening, the first fires began in the empty quarters. By dawn, 3/4 of Moscow was burning out of control. The French rushed for the fire engines and found the pumps gone. Rostopchin had taken the equipment with the people. Napoleon had captured the greatest prize of the war, and the prize, it turned out, was the trap all along. He had won a city that could feed no one and shelter nothing. So he did the one thing the arithmetic could not survive. He decided to wait. He was certain a letter of peace would arrive from Alexander. A week passed in the ashes, and no courier came. A second week passed, and the door stayed shut. Outside the city, his own quartermasters could read the arithmetic. Every idle day was a withdrawal from an account already overdrawn. By any reasonable accounting, this was the moment to cut the losses and go home. Instead, he waited a third week for a reply. Then a fourth week, and the autumn light began to shorten. 5 weeks he sat in the ruins, watching one shut door. He kept believing the silence meant an answer was coming. In Petersburg, Alexander had already given his answer. The letter was never coming, because the silence was the letter. Alexander understood he did not need to fight anymore. He let the distance and the calendar negotiate for him. The most powerful move in the whole war was to do nothing. Every day of that silence was killing the Grande Armée. The cannon had never frightened Alexander half as much as time did. By mid-October, even Napoleon could no longer pretend. There was nothing left to wait for but the road home. On the 19th of October, the order finally came. The Grande Armée turned its back on the ruined city. The men felt relief, believing the worst was behind them. The worst was not behind them. it was 1 week ahead. They were marching back along a road they had already stripped bare. Behind them, the ledger prepared its largest entry yet. The release valve had opened onto something far worse than the waiting. The retreat from Moscow had begun. At Maloyaroslavets, the road south was closed to them, so the army turned around and went back the way it came. It was the same road they had already eaten clean on the way in. There were no winter quarters waiting because they had burned them all. The empty horizon they had chased east was now the road they had to walk home. Cossacks rode the edges of the column, taking whoever fell behind. The march had become a slow subtraction done in the open. And then the weather, which no one had counted, arrived. For weeks, the cold had only threatened. In November, it stopped threatening. The muster clerk finally had a column he could not fill in. By November, the cold had fallen past 30 degrees below freezing. At that temperature, metal sticks to skin and breath freezes on beards. Men who sat down to rest by the road did not get up again. The column no one had counted for had arrived exactly on schedule. The horses went before the men did. Roughly 180,000 of them died on the march. Without horses, the cavalry was cavalry no longer. The guns had no teams to pull them, so the guns were left behind. An army built to move at speed could barely move at all. Then the infantry began to thin the same way the horses had. The machine was stopping one horse and one man at a time. And the cold was not even the smallest thing killing them. The smallest enemy on the whole campaign was an insect. In the huddled warmth of the camps, lice moved from coat to coat. 2 centuries later, scientists read the diseases straight from the dead. It was not one plague, it was 4 carried at once. Typhus, trench fever, relapsing fever, and paratyphoid all together. The army that had won every battle was being eaten from the inside. Cannon had not managed this. A louse managed it easily. And ahead of this ruined army lay one last river to cross. The river was the Berezina, and it was not fully frozen. The one good bridge had already been burned by the Russians. Behind them, the Cossacks were closing on the stragglers. In front of them, black water. Behind them, lances. No way across. By every calculation, the campaign should have ended here. There were no boats, no timber, and no time to build. The whole army stood at the water and waited to be finished. Except that one man had disobeyed an order weeks before. His name was General Jean-Baptiste Eblé, an engineer nobody had listened to. Weeks earlier, the order had come to burn the pontoon train. Eblé had read the order, and then he had simply kept the wagons. He had kept the tools, the forges, the iron clamps, and the cable. One quiet act of insubordination was the only reason a bridge was possible. But a bridge still had to be built, and the river was freezing. Behind the engineers, the whole wreck of the army was arriving. Not just soldiers now, but thousands who had followed the army east. All of them funneling toward one narrow stretch of frozen water. And behind them, the horizon had begun to move. Cossack guns and horsemen had shadowed the retreat for weeks. They had picked off stragglers at the edges the entire way. Ahead of them lay the river, and the river was open. Ice floes ground down the current, and no bridge stood anywhere. So at the water's edge, 2 fragile bridges were begun. One span was meant for the guns and the wagons. The other, narrower one, was meant only for the men. 2 thin lifelines for a crowd that had no count. At the bank, the wounded were laid out on the frozen ground. Abandoned wagons were being broken up and burned for warmth. Everyone else could only wait in the cold for a turn. And then, somewhere near the front, the pushing started. A dropped mitten lay in the snow, already forgotten. A family's abandoned cart sat tilted at the river's edge. The Cossack guns were closer now, ranging on the crossing. The bridges were the only way out, and everyone knew it. And everyone at the bank understood it would not hold them all. So the engineers picked up their tools and turned to the water. And so the last of them went down into the water themselves. Roughly 400 engineers had one job left in the world: hold 2 bridges up long enough for an army to walk across. The water was about 20 degrees below freezing. They stood in it in shifts, so the column above them would not stop. Their general stood on the bank and would not leave. For 3 days, the 2 bridges held, and the army crossed. There is nothing funny about this part, and it did not try to. And then the crossing ended, and someone counted the engineers. Of the roughly 400 who went into the water, about 40 walked back out. 90 in every 100 did not come out of that river. The general who built the bridges did not last much longer. Within weeks, the exhaustion finished what the river had started. The receipt for that crossing was written in their lives. And still, the river was not finished collecting. When it was over, the crossing had a name people could not forget. In France, the word is still in the dictionary today. It means a total disaster. It means this. But the river was only one line in a much longer bill. So here, at last, is the number the whole story has been walking toward. Of the 600,000 who marched in that summer, the men who could still fight would have fit inside a single village. One village. That was the whole return on the summer. 600,000 went east. A village came home. The muster clerk had a column for everything. Every column but one had balanced perfectly. The one that didn't was the one nobody had filled in. Somewhere west of the river, a few thousand men kept walking. Behind them, the emperor was already thinking about the next campaign. The army was still dying on the road when its commander quietly left it. On the 5th of December, at a town called Smorgoni, Napoleon handed over command. He climbed into a sled, gave a false name, and started for Paris. One companion rode beside him in that sled for the whole long way home. Caulaincourt heard everything and wrote it all down. His memoir was too honest to publish while the men in it still lived. So the commander reached home warm and safe, weeks ahead of his own army. But he sent word ahead of himself first. It was called the 29th Bulletin, and it was the first honest one. It admitted in plain official language that the army had been destroyed. It described the cold, the ruin, the hunger, the loss of nearly everything. And then, in its very last line, the bulletin turned to reassure the nation. The health of His Majesty has never been better. France read that line and understood exactly what it was not being told. At the very back of the retreat, one marshal refused to leave. This was Marshal Ney, the man his own soldiers called the bravest of the brave. He fought at the rear so the men in front of him could keep walking. By some accounts, he was the last French soldier to leave Russian soil. One man, one musket, walking out of the country that had swallowed an empire. He was the final name the clerk would ever cross onto that ledger's last line. Which raises the only question the ledger could never quite settle. Even now, historians cannot agree how few came back. The honest answer is somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000, depending on what you count. And even the generous count still fits in that village. The exact figure hardly matters when the scale of the loss is this plain. For 50 years, that loss stayed a column of numbers no one could feel. Then, in 1861, a French engineer decided to draw it instead. His name was Charles Minard, and he drew the whole campaign as a single line. On the way in, the line is thick, 420,000 men wide. Follow it across the page, and you watch that line thin with every mile. By the time it crawls home, the same line is barely there at all. One page, one shrinking line, and you can see the whole army disappear. It is the same tally the clerk kept, drawn instead of counted. And the whole of it comes down to one column that was never filled in. Every column in that ledger had balanced, every column but the one for the weather. And the weather was the only one that could kill you. The arithmetic was there from the start. The march happened anyway. 600,000 men, undone by the one thing nobody wrote down. The greatest army ever raised, beaten by a number no one thought to keep. There is really only one word left to add to a story like this. Napoleon himself is said to have summed it up on the road home. "From the sublime to the ridiculous," he murmured, "is but a single step. One step out of Russia, and the greatest empire in Europe had already tripped." And that, in one sentence, is the whole story of 600,000 men. See you next time.